The late afternoon sun cast a warm, orange glow over the quiet streets of Ridgewood. Mark Hensley drove his compact sedan home, his thoughts occupied by the day's meetings and deadlines. The low hum of the engine was a comforting constant, blending with the soft jazz playing on the radio. He sighed in relief, eager to unwind after a long day. As he neared a crossroad, the light turned yellow. Mark slowed his vehicle cautiously, coming to a smooth stop just as the light turned red. That's when a sharp flash of blue and red illuminated his rearview mirror, followed by the high-pitched wail of a siren. Frowning, Mark glanced back and eased his car to the shoulder. A police SUV pulled up behind him, its engine rumbling as a tall, broad-shouldered officer emerged. Officer Daniel Grayson adjusted his cap, his expression unreadable as he approached Mark's car. The badge pinned to his chest gleamed under the fading sunlight. "License and registration," Grayson said, his tone clipped and professional. Mark nodded calmly, retrieving his documents from the glove box and handing them over. Grayson studied the license briefly, his gaze flicking up to Mark as if measuring him. "Do you know why I stopped you?" the officer asked. "Not exactly," Mark replied evenly, his voice steady. "Was there an issue with the stoplight?" "You didn't come to a complete stop," Grayson said, though his voice carried a faint uncertainty. "Seemed like you were in a rush." Mark raised an eyebrow, but kept his tone respectful. "I believe I stopped in time, officer, but I understand if it didn't appear that way." Grayson lingered by the window, his eyes narrowing slightly as if searching for something beyond the simple act of stopping a car. The moment stretched longer than Mark expected, and the air between them grew tense. "You're new around here, aren't you?" Grayson asked suddenly. Mark hesitated briefly before responding. "I moved here about 6 months ago. My address is updated on the license." The officer nodded absently, but didn't seem to register the answer. His questions began to take a more pointed tone. "What's got you out and about this time of day?" "Just heading home," Mark said, his voice calm but firm. Grayson's posture shifted slightly, a subtle signal that this was no longer a casual traffic stop. Mark could feel the officer's growing suspicion, though he couldn't fathom what had triggered it. After a moment, Grayson folded the documents and tucked them into his chest pocket. "Step out of the vehicle." Mark's fingers tightened briefly on the steering wheel. He exhaled slowly before responding. "Is there a reason for this request, officers?" Grayson's lips twitched into a faint smirk. "Step out of the car. Let's not complicate things." Mark opened the door and stepped onto the pavement, his tailored work attire a stark contrast to the rugged officer's uniform. Standing tall but non-threatening, Mark's composed demeanor seemed to irk Grayson further. "Hands where I can see them," the officer instructed. Mark complied, his expression neutral. "Is there a specific concern here, Officer Grayson?" Grayson's smirk faded, replaced by a guarded look. "We've had some reports of suspicious activity in the area. Just taking precautions." Mark tilted his head slightly, locking eyes with Grayson. "Suspicious activity? Involving men in business suits driving sedans?" His tone was curious, not confrontational, but the question clearly unsettled the officer. Grayson's jaw tightened. "Just doing my job," he said curtly. "Where did you say you were coming from again?" "Work," Mark replied, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I manage a logistics firm downtown." Grayson paced a short circle in front of the car, his unease growing. Mark's poised, unflappable demeanor was unlike what the officer had come to expect in such situations. "You seem pretty composed," Grayson muttered, almost to himself. "Like you think you've got this all figured out." Mark gave a faint smile. "Staying calm is a habit of mine, officer. I believe it helps in situations like this." Grayson frowned. "You got something to hide?" "Nothing at all," Mark said evenly. "I just prefer clarity in interactions like these. It builds trust." The words hung in the air, disarming the officer more than Mark's calm presence. Grayson hesitated, his grip on his belt loosening slightly as the tension shifted. Before Grayson could respond, his radio crackled to life with an urgent dispatch. He raised the device to his ear, listening intently. His demeanor changed instantly, the suspicion replaced by a sudden urgency. Mark watched as the officer stepped back, his expression clouded with something between frustration and regret. "You're free to go," Grayson said briskly, handing back the documents. Without another word, he turned and strode toward his cruiser. Mark climbed back into his car, his movements steady. As he drove away, he glanced once in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the officer standing by his vehicle, still staring after him. Whatever the officer had been searching for, Mark knew it wasn't something he'd find that day. And as the car disappeared into the evening, Grayson couldn't shake the feeling that this interaction would linger with him far longer than it had with the composed man behind the wheel. As Mark drove away, the weight of the encounter lingered in the air, heavier for one man than the other. The rhythmic hum of the engine filled the silence inside the car, but Mark's mind replayed every detail, every word exchanged. His calm demeanor had carried him through, but the tension in the officer's voice, the unspoken accusations, and the unrelenting scrutiny left a faint sting beneath his otherwise composed exterior. He wasn't rattled, far from it, but he couldn't ignore the larger implications of what had just transpired. For Officer Grayson, the evening was far from over. He stood by his cruiser, watching the taillights of Mark's sedan vanish into the horizon. A knot twisted in his chest, a mixture of frustration, confusion, and, if he were honest with himself, shame. He'd approached the situation as he always did, with authority and a sharp edge, but Mark's unyielding composure had turned the tables. It wasn't just the man's answers or his quiet confidence. It was the undeniable feeling that Grayson had been wrong, not just in his assumptions, but in the way he'd let those assumptions shape his actions. Back in his car, Mark turned onto the quiet street leading to his home. The confrontation hadn't been the first of its kind, but it had solidified something in his mind. He thought about the subtle but powerful dynamics at play, the tension between power and poise, authority and respect. He resolved, as he always did, to navigate these moments with the same clarity and self-control that had carried him through tonight. For Mark, these encounters were not just tests of patience. They were reminders of a broader reality, one he couldn't afford to ignore. Meanwhile, Grayson sat in his cruiser, replaying the scene. Mark's words, calm, firm, unyielding, echoed in his mind. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is." Those words gnawed at him, forcing him to confront something he had long avoided: the way his own assumptions shaped his perception of others. For the first time in a long while, he questioned his approach, wondering if his instinctive suspicion had done more harm than good. As Mark pulled into his driveway and Grayson drove off to another call, the world outside moved on as if nothing had happened. But for both men, the encounter had left an indelible mark, one that would ripple into their future choices, shaping the way they saw themselves and the world around them. For Mark, the evening served as a stark reminder that control wasn't just about staying calm in the moment. It was about defining his own narrative, refusing to let others' biases dictate his truth. He stepped out of his car, taking a deep breath of the cool evening air, grateful to be home. Yet, beneath his calm exterior, he carried the quiet determination to keep pushing against the invisible barriers he encountered. For Grayson, the weight of introspection grew heavier as the night deepened. He couldn't ignore the quiet dignity Mark had shown, nor the way it made him question the cracks in his own assumptions. Perhaps, for the first time, he realized that authority came with the responsibility to listen, not just command. As the hours passed, he resolved to approach his badge not as a shield of power, but as a tool of trust, a small, yet significant, shift that might just alter his path. Both men, in their own ways, had learned something that night. Respect wasn't just earned, it was foundational.